Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Across the Pond podcast, or Pondcast, as me and Lindsay like to call it, with Lindsay, Director of the Consumer Centre at Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and me, International Fellow. And our guest today, it should need no introduction to people who have advocated for vaping and know what's going on in Australia, but we're going to discuss it, is Colin Mendelsohn, who's up nice and early for us in Sydney. Nice to have you join us, Colin.
Oh, thank you, Martin, for having me, and nice to meet you, Lindsay, as well.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Just to introduce Colin, he's been a GP for nearly 30 years, like I said, in Sydney, Australia, and spent 10 years in smoking cessation. He was the founding chair of the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, and he's been an investigator on many clinical trials on smoking and vaping over the years. And recently announced retirement, but you're still here, Colin. It seems
Yes. I
I
found that advocacy for vaping is very addictive, as it turned out. And as hard as I try to leave, unfortunately, I keep getting drawn back. But it's a very satisfying field to work in if you can achieve some of the goals that we're all aiming for, which as we know, are very challenging.
Well, we're glad you're still with us because you do an incredible job down there in really tough circumstances. Do you want to start? There was a Senate hearing recently which you gave evidence to. Do you want to explain how that Senate hearing came about, the situation in Australia for people who might know, and what that Senate public hearing was all about?
Yeah, so we've got essentially a prohibition model in Australia, driven by moral panic about young people vaping, basically. I mean, the focus is all about we've got to protect the children, and there's very little concern about the potential public health benefits for adults. So to vape legally in Australia, you need to find a doctor who'll give you a prescription for nicotine, and then try and find a pharmacist who'll have a product that will work for you. So people have to jump through all these hoops, and of course, smokers have said, I'm not sick, I'm not going to the doctor, and why should I? It's more expensive, it's inconvenient. The doctors have said, well, we don't want to do this. We're being told that vaping is not so good anyway, and we've got better things to do, and we really don't know much about it. And there's very few pharmacists who provide these products. So it's a real struggle to find the kit that you've found that's worked for you for the last 5 years, and the flavors and the whole nicotine setup. And so people just aren't doing it. So unfortunately, this model just isn't working, but the government's tried several times to double down and ban it further to make it work. And now, again, there's new legislation that's going through Parliament. It's before the Senate at the moment, and this is all about restricting vaping even further. So this is all about preventing manufacturing, commercial sale, commercial possession, marketing, and a number of other things, just to even tighten things up further. They're kind of doubling down repeatedly on a failed model. They've got this idea that prohibition is going to work, and the harder we double down, the more effective it will be. And we all know that's ridiculous, and that never works. But it's sort of become a political. It's become like the health minister has decided he's going to do this no matter what. He's going to break the smokers and the vapers, whatever happens. And he's trying to push this legislation through Parliament. He went to a parliamentary committee where, along party lines, they voted to support these further restrictions. But now it has to go to the Senate to be voted. And the good thing is that in Australia, we have got growing opposition to vaping at a political level. So yes, the federal government is pushing it, but a number of our leading opposition parties are starting to work out that this is just the wrong way to go. And we're hoping this legislation, to answer your question, at the end of the day will be rejected, and it may be the beginning of the end of the restrictions on smoking. That's what we're hoping. But of course, it could go the other way, because political decisions are notoriously unpredictable. Politicians do deals. I'll support this if you do that, and I don't think the public is willing for me to vote for that yet. And all these things happen, although privately, most of them do support the sort of regulatory model like we're seeing in New Zealand and the UK.
Funny enough, I just this second while you were talking wrote down a note raise the opposition that I've seen. Isn't it the Greens have decided to oppose the bill, or they're making noises, and some is it National Party MPs as well?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
so in Australia, the Labor Party is in government, and they're very opposed to vaping, and they tend to stick together. You don't get many voices separating from that group. The coalition, we have two leading parties in opposition: the National Party, which is opposed very strongly to vaping restrictions, and the Liberal Coalition, who privately support making vaping more available. So they're on side probably. And there's the Greens, which is an independent party, who support harm reduction and personal autonomy and all the principles of tobacco harm reduction, but they haven't yet come out in favour as a policy. They support, they've been very strong over the years on drug harm reduction in every form. But with tobacco harm reduction, for some reason, they've been unwilling to commit themselves. So we're waiting to find out exactly which way they'll vote. And we're a little bit concerned about this delay. But if the Greens support our approach, then this bill would be rejected. So we're kind of, it all hinges on that, as you suggest.
I have a quick question. Like, how many kids are actually vaping in Australia? I know, like y'all can't use the numbers anymore for the United States. Okay, our numbers have dropped by 60+%. But I know Martin's got to deal with it in the UK. You're seeing it kind of in New Zealand. I know in Australia, but what actually is the number of kids who are vaping? And also vaping daily?
Yeah. So. Our biggest national survey, which is the ASAD survey, it's not an annual survey, but it was done just recently, and they survey a huge number of kids across the country. It's the most reliable survey, and they found that 15.7% of 12 to 17-year-olds had vaped in the last month. So that's kind of our current user rate. 3% were vaping daily. Of course, like in the UK, the report said that half the kids who have vape once or twice. Most of the regular vaping is confined to kids who used to smoke, or used to smoke. But there is a small number of frequent vapers. So they said 4.8% of 12 to 17-year-olds vape at least 20 days a month, and there's another 3% who vape daily. Now, it sounds like a lot, and it's actually more than it is in the UK and the US. In fact, we've got one of the highest vaping rates amongst kids in the world, in spite of our incredibly harsh restrictions, which tells you a lot. They're clearly not working, but the percentage of vapers in Australia made up by that youth population is 5 to 6%. 5 to 6% of our total vaping population is youth. So we're basing our whole policy on a very small number of young people who are vaping, who are experiencing relatively trivial harms, and we're ignoring the lethal consequences of smoking to the older population, to their parents and grandparents, who are the ones who are at risk of dying. And that's where we've got it totally wrong. We've got that balance that we all talk about, that weighing that balance between the kids and the adults. We've got that wrong, and we're making it harder and harder for adults to access vaping products legally.
Sorry, to go into that, I know, I was looking at the Canadian youth numbers, and you're actually seeing an increase in kids who think that cigarettes aren't that bad. There's no with this pushback towards vaping, that we've kind of lost our sight towards like what actually does cause the most harm. But Australia should already kind of know. What I don't get about Australia with your tobacco harm reduction restriction policies, you guys have one of the worst black markets when it comes to combustible cigarettes. Can you tell us more about that whole situation and what's going on there?
We complain every time the government puts up tobacco taxes. Look, we all know that's the most effective strategy for reducing smoking at a public health level. That works. But it gets to a point where you have these eye-watering levels of taxation. We have the highest cigarette prices in the world, and New Zealand's a close second. But the problem is there are many people who are addicted who just can't quit. And a lot of them are lower socioeconomic and groups, and they are struggling with these prices. They just can't afford it, but they can't stop. And so, of course, they seek out the chop and the imported cigarettes that are widely available. And look, various estimates for this range from 10 to 50% of the market. It's probably something like 25% of the market, which is a huge loss of tobacco tax. But these low prices of the illicit products also reduce the price signal that stops people smoking. So it's a bad thing all round. And it's run by organised crime, and you have all the problems with that as well. It's a disaster. And yet the government keeps raising the money raising the taxes.
What I was going to say was kind of on the same subject. It was about in the UK at the moment, we've got some pretty poor legislation going through, which could negatively affect vaping. And one of the arguments they say is, look, if you do this, you're going to increase the black market. And it seems politicians now seem to be saying, oh, black market, that's just something invented by the tobacco industry.
I know, I've seen this.
But you're seeing it, aren't you? I'm hearing of bombings and
yes.
do you want to tell us what's going on with that?
Yeah, look, the black market sounds harmless enough, but when you look into the detail, what's happening is we've handed control of a huge public health opportunity to criminal networks. So 90% of the products supplied in Australia are supplied by criminals. So they import vaping products from China. They sell them through retail outlets, social media, a whole range of networks. And these are totally unregulated products. So it's great having a set of standards, but no one's using them. And we've created a turf war between these criminal gangs. This is a highly lucrative industry. And we're getting fire bombings. We've had at least 70 fire bombings of tobacco and vape shops over the last 12 months. We've had 3 homicides related to this turf war. There's extortion, there's standover tactics. These gangs are employing young people to do some of their dirty work. It's really a disaster. One of our criminologists recently pointed out this is the second biggest illicit drug market in Australia, vaping, after cannabis. And then cocaine was third. So, we've created this problem. And for some reason, the politicians are ignoring it. And what really worries me is that we hear supposed experts from other countries like the UK and Canada saying, oh, look, in Australia, they've got this prescription model. Is really, we should do that because that'll cut back on products, illegal products, and on vaping. No, it's the worst thing you could do.
Yeah, it's very sad. I was just thinking this today, is that we've got our Prime Minister and government sort of talking about how the prescription idea would be a good idea. They've actually consulted with people in Australia. And what's worse, we're going to have a new government. There's no doubt about it. Rishi Sunak's going to lose the next election. And the Shadow Health Secretary went on a fact-finding mission last year to Australia and came back and said, you've got to see what they got over there. Well, I love it. I love it.
But the problem, Martin, is she talks to the wrong people. So she talks to Simon Chapman and Emily Banks. There's a little cabal of tobacco control experts in Australia who have had a lot of influence over the years and have the ear of the Prime Minister, Health Minister. And unfortunately, he listens to them and takes their word as gospel. And unfortunately, there's, in this field, as you know, it's very polarized. And there are certain people who take a very strong view and for various reasons will not let go of that view in spite of the evidence. And, the evidence does not support tobacco control. I don't know if you saw the e-cigarette summit a couple of days ago in Washington, but Ron Borland, who's our leading tobacco scientist in Australia, but certainly one of the leading. Ron's comment was, Australia's prescription model has been an abject failure. And that's not me saying it. That's Ron Borland. And so if Ron Borland says something, I take serious note of it. And the other thing is our border force and our police departments in these recent Senate inquiries and state inquiries into vaping, the border force and the police have said, look, we can't control this. We've got 8 million containers coming into Australia. We can't stop the 120 million vapes that come in each year. And the police haven't got the resources as well. Even when they get to Australia, they can't go around checking on shops and social media outlets. And they've admitted we cannot control this. And we know with prohibition, it's only going to go underground. Prices will go up. Products become more dangerous. People become criminalized. You get these turf wars with killings and retaliations. It's a disaster, just getting worse and worse.
I have a question for, I guess, both of you guys, because what I'm newer to the tobacco thing and to, e-cigarettes started in 2016. But one of the things that's always kind of surprised me is even when you're latching onto the kids, it just seems that there's been so much more pushback towards these tobacco harm reduction products than there ever has been in the history when we were looking at combustible cigarette. I mean, and you had way more kids that were using these in both, and I think in all of the countries. And it also seems that it's relatively new too. And then it's just weird. How do we counteract that, especially when you see the numbers? Because like I never expected it to what you guys are all dealing in all the other countries with these youth vaping epidemic stuff, because it did decrease in the United States. So that seemed like what the world was kind of latching onto now, or what it was then. Now they're kind of like just pushing back to you guys, which again, your numbers are not epidemic. They're not US 2019 numbers.
Yeah.
Like, how do you push back on that? And also this, this whole this children stuff, because it does seem that at the end of the day, who is losing out on it is the adults.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. The adults are the ones who are at immediate risk and substantial risk of death and illness from smoking. And we've got to help them. Most of them want to quit and they can't. And unfortunately, the surveys show in all of our countries that usage rates are highest in the young people and young adults. And what's interesting is in the young adults who have the highest vaping rates, their smoking rates are falling faster than ever in all of our countries. I mean, is that not a clear signal that vaping is playing a role? Yes, a lot of them didn't smoke, but they're not smoking now. And it's often that they're diverted away from smoking, and that's a good thing. So I think that they didn't smoke, but they're now vaping isn't necessarily a problem. And overall, I think the public health benefit is very positive. In Australia, of 12 to 17-year-olds, 0.3% smoke daily, 0.3% in our ASAD survey, the student alcohol and drug survey, 0.9% in our national drug strategy survey, which is a much smaller survey, but it's a small number. And yet we're focused on vaping, which has trivial risks, and which, as you found in the UK and they're finding in Canada, this is a passing fad. Rates go up, kids try it for a while, and then they come down again. And most of the regular vaping is by kids who've smoked or who would have smoked. And the pattern of use, which is mostly infrequent and transient, is not associated with any significant harm or very little harm. And yet we've got into this moral panic that's kind of feeding itself and has political repercussions. It's a kind of a political win to be able to say we're protecting the children. And I think that's holding some of the politicians back, because we often hear the politicians say, well, when we go to visit members of parliament, they say, well, I've had a mother and I've had people stop me in the street saying, but what about my kids vaping? And they're feeling under pressure in response to this moral panic. But the moral panic is just that. It's an exaggerated concern, and the real risk is very small.
No, I agree entirely. I sometimes think I'm living in some sort of like weird, outside reality or something, because yes. I'm old enough to remember. I'm a sports fan. I go to events, and I've noticed, like, I'm a big cricket fan. I go to the Oval in Surrey's ground, right. A test ground, and I notice more now. You see people in their 20s who are using vaping products, and you don't see almost any of them smoking anymore. And yet I know that 10, 15, 20 years ago, that same age group would have been smoking. And I think, well, this is surely a step forward for public health.
Yeah.
But I can only assume that it's because the misinformation is so strong that the harm that is perceived from, like you said, mums and other people, they seem to think they're the same as cigarettes. So the best thing a government could do, surely, is educate people properly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think at a public health level, we're getting an enormous benefit, even in that population. Yes, a lot of them are doing it, and it doesn't appeal to the sensitivities of certain people, the Puritans, and the people with strong moral views about people using drugs. We can't let people use drugs. We have to stop all drugs. But the reality is that actually it's beneficial for public health, whether those people like it or not. and that's the priority.
Yeah.
Do you guys have the same pushback against every other product? Are you seeing like pushback against heated tobacco? Are you seeing pushback against the nicotine pouches that we're getting here in the States? Thank you, Durban.
Yeah. We're getting articles about in the media about pouches and a moral outrage about that. We don't see a lot of heated tobacco, but
do you guys have heated tobacco in Australia?
No, it's not. It's not. You can get it, but it's really hard. You have to get a prescription from a doctor. You have to pay enormous amounts of. It's $2,000 per kilogram tax for heated tobacco price. Yeah, $2,000. So people try and get it through, and sometimes they get caught. It's just ridiculous. So, and yet you know, yeah. So and because they weigh, it's all based on weight. And it adds enormously to the price, but there are very few doctors who'll prescribe it anyway, and people have to source it internationally. It's just too difficult.
Wow. I mean, I still think here in the States that we don't have it yet, and because you got to go through, the States might as well have a prescription only model when you look at like how much difficulty and how much money it takes to get a newer tobacco product out. We only have like 45 products that have used the PMTA pathway compared to tens of thousands of products that have gone through substantial or whatever equivalents on that. But I still think it's going to take it by storm, especially because we do and here in the States, you've just seen so much misinformation. I mean, it's not. I like the old dive bars. It's not uncommon for me to go meet somebody, that's older and I'm vaping and they're looking at me like I'm crazy and they're smoking a cigarette.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the misinformation is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, we have such good evidence now, but there's never going to be enough evidence. Certain things just don't seem to go away. It's like I remember being involved in a working group that wrote an article about nicotine about, must be 10, 15 years ago now. Roundtable group, we looked at all the evidence on nicotine and wrote an article saying, yeah, look, it doesn't cause cancer, it doesn't cause heart disease, it's relatively benign. No one seems to have taken any notice. And of course, we keep having those same reports from so many different organizations, but it doesn't seem to get through. It's like people have associated that with smoking and they just aren't willing to change their minds. So that information really sticks, and I think it's driving a lot of bad behaviors. If we could switch, if people were better informed, more would switch, and they'd stay switched.
I was brought up, I'm in my 57th year, and when I was a kid, we used to have adverts on the TV where Superman swooped in on a guy called Nicotine, who was trying to get kids to smoke in the playground. And I did some research into this, found out the Nicotine, the character, was first devised back in 1967. So I think for years, nicotine and smoking and cigarettes have kind of been interchangeable in people's minds. And I think that's probably the reason, isn't it? And it needs a bit of education on nicotine. I know, there are films that have been made, and GFN often says we need to rethink nicotine. That needs to be the way forward. Do you not think? Yeah.
Yeah, look, education, absolutely. But we need to get the government on side and the media on side. I mean, the amount of misinformation in the media is mind-boggling. They're looking for negative alarmist studies, case studies. The parent said she's never going to let her kid vape after she nearly died. I mean, vaping causes ED, all these really scary things. And unfortunately, when you say those things often enough, they stick. And people have in the back of their mind, I've read all this bad stuff about vaping, so I better keep smoking because at least I know what's in that. I mean, it's just illogical. Well, and I think we need to start. We need to get the government starting at that level as well, putting out like they do in the UK, putting out clear guidelines about vaping and the relative risks, so people can make an informed decision.
They're being eroded right now as we speak. Okay, I mean, right now we've got the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. That if you go to websites, government websites, they say pretty positive things about tobacco harm reduction and e-cigarettes, but you can sit here and see how it's getting cracked because there is a lot of a lot of pushback against it. Now Yeah, we are getting towards the end of this. So, I mean, and one of the things I do want to emphasize is that, you are a doctor, like what advice, if you could give to doctors, when it comes, if they've got a person who smokes, that's tried everything, that the government does recommend, what would you do as a doctor, to that
Look, it's
person who
very
might be
hard.
misinformed about it?
Yeah, look, it's very hard, Lindsay, because they're constantly getting negative messages from our leading health bodies, from our leading health charities, medical associations, and so on. Look, there are two main sets of guidelines in Australia. One was developed by the NHMRC, which is our leading science and health research organisation, and another through the Australian National University. And everyone goes back and says, oh, but these guidelines say this, and they recommend that. But we did peer-reviewed critiques of both those guidelines, with one of them with leading international health experts from your country, Nancy Rigotti and Ken Warner, not Ken Warner on that one, Nancy Rigotti and Neil Benowitz, and in the UK, Anne McNeil, and others. And we decided they were just unscientific, full of scientific errors, misinformation, they were biased, and they weren't fit for purpose. But there was no attention to those published critiques. So they just nothing. No, we couldn't get the media to say to take that seriously. So everyone just goes back to these two reports and says, oh, but the NHMRC says this. So therefore, we can't allow. They say it's a gateway. Well, Mendelssohn says it's not. Who cares about that? So, we need to get the government at least to change the guidelines. And some of the great advice that's coming out of the UK from the NHS, for example, and the CRUK and the National Centre for Smoking, Tobacco and Cessation, Smoking Cessation and Training. So authoritative information would be really useful. And then we need to get the media on side. I think that will happen as policy starts changing. But at the moment, they're really hostile. And people keep reading all this misinformation in the media, and over a while, it just sticks.
I always say, we always try and end on something positive. I always say that, we are kind of in the depths in a lot of countries, especially Commonwealth countries for some reason. At the moment, with the UK going backwards and Australia seemingly very bad, and that's a kind way of saying it. And Canada kind of going backwards as well.
Yeah, pushing back.
But I always say that all the science is on our side, all the evidence is on our side. Yeah. So surely at some point things will break, and exactly. Common sense will have to emerge, won't it?
Exactly. I think there's only so long you'll be able to say, look, the evidence says this, when clearly it's not. I mean, we just look across the waters to New Zealand, our closest neighbour. We've had very similar tobacco control policies, and our smoking rates have been coming down together. We've been a bit ahead, but since they legalised and introduced vaping in 2020, over the next 3 years, their smoking rate fell by 43%. I mean, it was just unprecedented. It fell particularly in the Maori, their indigenous population, in the low SES populations. And in Australia, it's more than twice as fast as the fall in Australia. Their daily smoking rate's now 6.8%. And there have been no other major public health tobacco control changes. So it's fairly clear that vaping is the key factor here. I mean, what more evidence do you need? There's almost no black market. Yes, there are more kids vaping, but since they've introduced the legislation, that's starting to fall, and it is falling. And they're getting tax revenue. I mean, it's just, it's what the UK is trying to do, and it's doing almost as well, but they've had the benefit of doing it a little bit later. And it's been taken up and it's working well. And that's what we all should be aspiring to, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Did you have anything more to say? Do you want to wrap up, Lindsay?
I can wrap up. Do you have anything else to say, Dr. Mendelssohn?
Look, I think vaping isn't going away. I mean, all these new tobacco harm reduction treatments, there's hostile opposition, and it's very hard to get them introduced from the beginning. But over time, the evidence becomes stronger. And we look back a few years later and we'll say, well, why on earth did we delay this? So I think at the end of the day, we will win this, but unfortunately there will be harm done. People will, will smoke in the meanwhile, and people will have a lot of stress as a result of it, but we will win, because the evidence becomes undeniable over time. And it is for us, and probably for you as well, a political decision. It's all about the key policy makers, and I think we just need to keep the pressure on. I think, you know, with the health organisations, the pro-vaping organisations, and the vapor organisations, you know, the pressure will gradually build, and the scientific evidence, and we will have hopefully a more effective model eventually.
Can I just add one little thing to that? Because I always like to remind people of this. Nicotine has been used, we know this from archaeology, for 12,000 years or more. Anyone who thinks they're going to eradicate nicotine use is living in cloud cuckoo land. So the trick is to help people who use it in the safest form possible. That's what I would say.
Exactly. I agree. I read your article recently, and I agree entirely that you know, the idea that we're going to eliminate nicotine is just a joke, and it just shows how ignorant a lot of the opposition to vaping is. And it's going to be around. We have to accept it, whether we like it or not. I like it. A lot of people don't. I don't like it personally, but I do like it as a public health measure, and it will become legally available in Australia much more freely and elsewhere, I'm sure, over time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Mendelsohn, for joining us. And I know Martin and I are looking forward to seeing you at GFN, and our viewers who are watching, make sure to check us all out, because I think we're all speaking at GFN.
And that'll be great.
Oh, it's going to be fantastic. And viewers, thanks for checking out our latest episode of Across the Pond. Make sure to check out all of our other episodes, and feel free to reach out to me if you've got any guests that you'd like to see. Thank you.